Well, welcome again to the book of Psalms. We're going to be continuing today with Psalm 120. We thought we'd never quite get through Psalm 119 with 176 verses, but we're now to Psalm 120. And the next 8 Psalms that we're going to look at are songs of ascent. Now, if you've ever been to the Holy Land, you'll know that almost everything going to Jerusalem is uphill. Of course, with our cars and our buses, we don't notice it as much. But if you're walking and you're traveling toward Jerusalem, especially toward the Temple Mount area, you've got to walk uphill an awful lot. So these are the Psalms of Ascent. They're the songs the people were taught to sing as they went to worship. And they're full of theology, full of looking back on the history of Israel. And we're going to see some of those things as we continue through these Psalms of Ascent. The first one is Psalm 120, and it was sung by pilgrims as they ascended to Jerusalem. I don't know if you remember the old hymn from your hymn books. We don't have it in the hymn books these days, but it said, "We're marching to Zion." Well, if you were going to Jerusalem, you'd be going up to Mount Zion, and you would be enjoying the thrill of knowing you were going to the tabernacle and eventually, after Solomon has built it, to the temple. These are the folks who were singing songs of grace. They were preparing for worship. It was so in Israel that when you started to worship, you were going to the core of Israel's worship, to the tabernacle or to the temple. And when you did that, you sang happy songs. I don't know what you know about music in Israel, but after the captivities and after the destruction of Jerusalem, most of the songs that we hear from Jerusalem that are religious songs or spiritual songs are in a minor key. But in the days of David and Solomon, more of those songs were in a major key, and if you go and watch some of their festivals today, you'll see really happy dancing and joyous music that goes on. They don't know the experience of being forgiven and having songs about forgiveness to sing. But these songs were about the failure of the people to have great joy in their lives. So this is what the psalmist says in 120, and we'll look on down to verse 5, and he says, "How I suffer in far-off Meshech. It pains me to live in distant Kedar. I'm tired of living among people who hate peace. I search for peace, but when I speak of peace, they want war." So you're having a people who are coming out of the experience of captivity, the experience of bondage, the experience of unpleasantness. We know something about that today. We live in a time when there's such conflict, there's such bitterness, there's such warring among members of our society. So we can appreciate something of the spirit that the psalmist struggled with in Psalm 120, which moves us on to Psalm 121. And here the psalmist changes modality and promises that the Lord is our caregiver, the one who watches over us and who protects us from natural disasters as well as other dangers that are around us in life. You'll get some of that flavor when you read in Psalm 121, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation, and you remember these words, much more familiar to us In the King James, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. And here in the Living Translation it says, He will not let you stumble. The one who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel never slumbers or sleeps. God is always watching. He knows what's happening in our lives. He cares for us in the darkest night. One of my favorite hymns that Ruth sings is, His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He cares for me. And Jesus made mention of the Father's care over the little sparrow, and He knew what was happening in that little tiny bird. So even more, He cares for us. And so when the psalmist writes here, he says, the sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. If you've ever lived in a desert climate, you'll know that living in the sun all day long gets to be a struggle of experience unless you can find shade or an oasis. But if you're out in the middle of the hot sun, you can suffer from heat stroke or sunstroke, and it's a dangerous place to be. But the psalmist says, the sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon at night. The Lord keeps you from all harm and watches over your life. The Lord keeps watch over you as you come and go, both now and forever. So the reassurance that the Lord is watching over our lives and protecting us from natural disaster is what the psalmist is saying here in Psalm 121. And the next psalm of ascent, or degree as they're sometimes called in the English Bible, is Psalm 122. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Now here we are, standing inside your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a well-built city. Its seamless walls cannot be breached. All the tribes of Israel, the Lord's people, make their pilgrimage there. And we know there were times when the city walls were breached. But the psalmist was aware of the fact that the city was a stronghold, and it protected its people when the gates of the city or the walls of the city were guarded, the gates closed. It was a time for protection of the people. But the psalmist reminded them that they were to pray for the peace in Jerusalem. May all who love this city prosper, he says. O Jerusalem, may there be peace within your walls and prosperity in your palaces. May you have peace for the sake of the house of the Lord our God. I will seek what is best for you, O Jerusalem. Here's a prayer that we look at and we say, peace? And not so in Canaan, not so in the Holy Land. There's war almost all the time. Even when there's a peaceful situation, there are attacks, rockets being fired, people being killed, and war going on at various levels, and high levels and small levels. But the psalmist is ready to pray for what God plans for his city. He's ready to pray for peace. And we should too. The time is coming when our Lord himself will reign from the city of Jerusalem, the throne of his father David in human terms, and he will let the world know what it's like to have peace on earth for 1,000 years. And we're to pray for that peace that's going to come one day. It will be a glorious time. We will see peace like we've never seen it before. We'll understand what God intends for his people to happen in that 1,000 years that's described in the book of Revelation. In Psalm 123, which is the next of our Psalms of Ascent, it describes God as a master with attentive servants. And so the servants watch their master for guidance. We used to tease my mother whenever one of the children would act out, they would get the look. And you didn't have to hear any words. You didn't have to say anything about that situation. When my mother looked at you, you knew that you stood in condemnation and judgment, and you better behave yourself, because the next phase was wrath coming from her mouth, or perhaps punishment that my father would mete out at her instruction. Well, the psalmist here is talking about the servants who are guided by their master's looks. Notice what it says in Psalm 123 in verse 2. We keep looking to the Lord our God for his mercy, just as servants keep their eyes on their master, as a slave girl watches her mistress for the slightest signal. And our prayer is, have mercy on us, Lord, have mercy, for we have had our fill of contempt. We have had more than our fill of the scoffing of the proud and the contempt of the arrogant. Just as you could experience the condemnation of a look, you could also feel the mercy of a look and the joy that comes when you are nurtured and praised by the look of a parent, or perhaps a master in this case, when the servant looks at the master. That moves us to Psalm 124, where we ascribe the safety of Israel to the power and help of the Lord. We reaffirm the protection of the Red Sea and entering into Canaan. Do you remember the story? Well, Psalm 24 repeats it for us. What if the Lord had not been on our side? Let all Israel repeat. What if the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us? Can you hear this antiphonal experience as the people march up toward the city? The priests may say, what if the Lord had not been on our side? And the people answer back, what if the Lord had not been on our side? And then the answer comes, they would have swallowed us alive in their burning anger. The waters would have engulfed us. A torrent would have overwhelmed us. Yes, the raging waters of their fury would have overwhelmed our very lives. Praise ye the Lord, who did not let their teeth tear us apart. The psalmist putting the nation of Israel and its threat for destruction into the picture of a bear or a lion or a bird trapped in a hunter's trap. And he says, in conclusion, our help is from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Israel had a history of being protected by God. We've talked about it so many times, but it's worth repeating. When you worship in Israel, you worship remembering what God has done. We look back as members of God's family on the great miracles he's performed, taking the firstborn of Egypt and breaking the back of Pharaoh and his taskmasters, bringing the people to the edge of the Red Sea, and then miraculously parting that sea so that the people could march across. And then coming to the River Jordan and seeing the same experience so that the waters did not overwhelm them at that point. And we don't have to be Jewish to appreciate that, do we? You've had those kinds of experiences in your life where God has done wonderful things, blessings that you and I really can't fully appreciate until we look back and see what God has done. So we need to start worship as well, thanking God for the good things he's done in our lives, thanking him for the blessings of the past. Most of all, thanking him for forgiveness, for redemption from our sins, and from keeping us from the penalty that we rightly deserve. Now we turn to Psalm 125. Again, it's one of the songs of ascent to Jerusalem, and it is a reference to the faith, the stronghold faith of the people of Israel. Here's what the psalmist says: "Those who trust in the Lord are as secure as Mount Zion." If you have the foundation of a mountain underneath you, you certainly have a strength that protects you. They will not be defeated, but will endure forever. Just as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forever. Think about that. So the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forever. There's never a time in your life or mine when we are beyond the care of God, when he surrounds us with his love. You come a little bit later to Psalm 134, you come to that great experience of repeating over and over again, his great love endures forever. And so this is one of the lead-in psalms in 125. Verse 4 of this psalm says, "O Lord, do good to those who are good, whose hearts are in tune with you, and banish those who turn to crooked ways, O Lord. Take them away with those who do evil. May Israel have peace." Peace in Israel is always founded on the trust in God that is described here in the Psalms. Psalm 125 then moves on to Psalm 126, and here we get another of the ascent hymns or songs, and it reminds the people as they sing going up to Jerusalem, when the Lord brought back his exiles to Jerusalem, it was like a dream. Well, you see, the psalmist goes back, and there are times prior to Israel being in captivity, and then later on, when they sing the songs of Israel, there are times when they're singing those out of the reflection of their captivity after the kingdom has been destroyed, after Solomon and the kings divided into north and south. So when you come to 126, you look ahead in this psalm and you hear the Lord bringing back his exiles to Jerusalem. They were filled with laughter. We sang for joy. And the other nations said, "What amazing things the Lord has done for them." Yes, the Lord has done amazing things for us. What joy. And there's a verse that we often take out of context. And I'm talking about 126, 5 and 6. And I hear it used in sermons sometimes about reaching out to people and bringing them to the message of Christ. And it's a good application. But it says, "Those who plant in tears will harvest with shouts of joy. They weep as they go to plant their seed, but they sing as they return with the harvest." And I think it's possible for us to say we take the good news to those who have not heard it, and we bring in our sheaves, as one of the other hymns say, as we rejoice over what God has done through his word. But we get that expression from here in Psalm 126. It leads us then to Psalm 127, where we have an illustration of the joys of families, of hard work, and of children. When you listen to this psalm, you get the idea that Solomon really understood the importance of God underlying the relationship between husbands and wives. In the King James it says, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh, but in vain." And then as we move to the New Living Translation, it's a little easier for us to understand and follow. "Unless the Lord protects a city, guarding it with its sentries will do no good. It's useless for you to work so hard, from early morning until late at night, anxiously waiting for food to eat, for God gives rest to his loved ones." This is probably a good verse for workaholics to remember that we spend a lot of time working and we don't enjoy the fruits of our labor because God has promised to give those things. But the real gifts that we enjoy begin in verse 3. "Children are a gift from the Lord. They are a reward from him. Children born to a young man are like arrows in a warrior's hands. How joyful is the man whose quiver is full of them. He will not be put to shame when he confronts his accusers at the city gates." Your children and mine, Lord willing, will be those who praise us in front of our friends and our business associates and others that we know in our neighborhoods and in our communities. God uses families to enhance our relationships to each other. And so in this psalm, Solomon gives us this background and tells us how important children are. And that leads us to Psalm 128, the final one for this lesson. Another song for those marching to Jerusalem. And listen to the joy that comes through in this psalm. "How joyful are those who fear the Lord, all who follow his ways. You will enjoy the fruit of your labor. How joyful and prosperous you will be. Your wife will be like a fruitful grapevine, flourishing within your home. Your children will be like vigorous young olive trees as they sit around your table. That is the Lord's blessing for those who fear him. May the Lord continually bless you from Zion. May you see Jerusalem prosper as long as you live, and may you live to enjoy your grandchildren. May Israel have peace." You know, there's one thing that concludes this psalm that we don't have to question. May you live long enough to enjoy your grandchildren. Nobody gets old enough to have grandchildren that really doesn't experience a new joy. Children are beautiful. I think I'm one of those who really enjoys little children that you can hold in your arms and very often hold them until they fall asleep. I'll never forget on one of the television shows I was on when I was interviewed for writing a book that the host's little son, who was about 2 years old, came wandering out onto the TV set where we were, and he looked at his daddy and looked at me, and he wasn't quite sure what to do. So he came over and sat in my lap. It was just a few minutes until he had settled in and had fallen asleep. And I think about that experience and I say to myself, one of the great joys of life is taking a young child, allowing that child to relax and to rest in your arms. And isn't that the way God is with us? He sees us when we're confused, when we don't quite know what to do. He takes us in his arms. He holds us close. He nurtures us, and we fall asleep in the security of his grace and his love. The psalmist understood that, and so he said, enjoy your grandchildren, and may you have peace in Jerusalem while you do. Well, we'll pick it up at that point the next time as we look further at these songs of ascent going up to Jerusalem. God bless you.